The first bite was always the most telling. Tender, rich, with a flavor that lingered on the palate long after the last swallow. Customers at Valdez Brothers Smokehouse in El Paso couldn't get enough of their signature brisket. Food bloggers traveled from across the Southwest just to taste what they called the most authentic barbecue this side of heaven. But heaven had nothing to do with what was really happening behind those kitchen doors. For 3 years, the Valdez family served their community with smiles, handshakes, and what everyone believed was the finest smoked meat in Texas. The local newspaper featured them on the front page. Food Network scouts came calling. The mayor even declared a Valdez Brothers Day to celebrate their contribution to the city's culinary scene. No one suspected that beneath the praise, the awards, and the packed dining room lay a secret so horrifying it would shake the very foundation of trust in one of America's most beloved food traditions. This is Unmasking Evil, where we uncover the darkest secrets hiding in plain sight. If you think you can handle the truth about what really happened at Valdez Brothers Smokehouse, stay with us. But be warned, once you know this story, you'll never look at your favorite restaurant the same way again. Diego Valdez learned the art of butchery not from culinary school, but from necessity. Growing up in Juarez during the height of the cartel wars, Diego's family operated a small meat processing plant that served both legitimate customers and those who paid premium prices for silence. Food contamination and meat fraud cases have plagued the industry for decades, with recent studies showing that artificial enhancement and replacement of genuine meat products account for significant portions of food fraud cases. But Diego's operation went far beyond simple fraud. By age 16, Diego could break down a carcass with surgical precision. His father, Esteban Valdez, ran the plant with an iron fist and connections that reached deep into both sides of the law. When bodies needed to disappear, when evidence needed to vanish, people came to the Valdez plant. Cash changed hands, questions weren't asked, and problems were solved with a combination of acid, fire, and industrial meat grinders. The business model was simple: legitimate cattle and pork came through the front door during the day, while other deliveries arrived under cover of darkness. Everything was processed, packaged, and distributed through the same channels. The beauty of the operation was its simplicity. Who would question a meat processing plant for processing meat? But in 2019, a rival cartel decided to send a message. They firebombed the Valdez plant, killing Esteban and destroying 30 years of carefully built infrastructure. Diego barely escaped with his life, but he lost everything else: his father, his business, and his identity. That's when he made the decision that would change everything. He would cross the border, start fresh, and build something legitimate. Or so he told himself. El Paso welcomed Diego Valdez with open arms. He arrived with enough cash to start over, a tragic backstory about losing his family business to cartel violence, and an encyclopedic knowledge of meat preparation that impressed every supplier and customer he met. Within 6 months, Diego had partnered with his cousin Carlos to open Valdez Brothers Smokehouse. The restaurant was an instant success. Diego's smoking techniques, learned from years of covering up evidence, produced flavors that local food critics called otherworldly. His brisket developed a cult following. His specialty sausages sold out daily. But running a legitimate restaurant was expensive. Really expensive. Food costs, labor, rent, and regulations ate into profits faster than Diego had anticipated. Within a year, Valdez Brothers was struggling to break even despite packed dining rooms. That's when Diego started making compromises. It began small, expired meat that he could save, with his smoking techniques, roadkill that no one would miss, stray animals that wandered too close to the restaurant. Diego's smoking process could mask almost any flavor, and his spice blends could hide almost any texture. Customers never complained because they never knew. But as the restaurant's popularity grew, so did Diego's need for cheap protein. Local homeless populations began disappearing at an alarming rate. Missing person reports piled up on police desks, but in a border city plagued by violence and human trafficking, a few missing transients barely registered as news. Carlos Valdez believed he was living the American dream. His cousin Diego had saved him from a life of poverty in Mexico, brought him to El Paso, and made him a partner in what was becoming the most successful restaurant in the city. Carlos handled the front of the house, greeting customers, managing staff, handling the books, while Diego worked his magic in the kitchen. For 2 years, Carlos never questioned where Diego sourced their meat. The prices were unbelievably low, the quality was consistently high, and their profit margins were better than any restaurant in the city. When Carlos asked, Diego always had an answer: bulk purchasing, supplier relationships, trade secrets from the old country. But Carlos wasn't stupid. He noticed things. He noticed that Diego always worked alone in the prep kitchen during late-night hours. He noticed that their meat deliveries never came during business hours. He noticed that their special blend sausages had flavors that no amount of seasoning could explain. Most disturbing of all, Carlos noticed that some of their regular customers, particularly the homeless men who often came in for free meals, had stopped coming around. When he asked Diego about it, his cousin just shrugged. "They move on," Diego said. "That's what homeless people do." The truth hit Carlos like a physical blow on a Tuesday evening in March 2022. He had forgotten his keys and came back to the restaurant after closing to retrieve them. The back door was unlocked, and he could hear sounds coming from the prep kitchen, sounds that didn't belong in any restaurant. Carlos crept through the dark dining room and peered through the kitchen window. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. Diego was standing over a stainless steel table, methodically working with a bone saw. But this wasn't a cow or pig on the table. The body was too small, too human. Carlos watched in horror as his cousin worked with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. That's when Carlos realized the truth about their success. Their award-winning brisket, their famous sausages, their secret blend that customers raved about. It wasn't beef. It wasn't pork. It was human flesh, and Carlos had been serving it to families, children, and elderly couples for over 2 years. Carlos ran. He made it to his car, drove home, and vomited until there was nothing left in his stomach. But he didn't call the police. Not yet. Because calling the police would mean admitting that he had been part of this nightmare, that he had unknowingly fed human flesh to thousands of people. Instead, Carlos made a decision that would cost him everything. He would try to stop Diego himself. Carlos spent 3 sleepless nights planning what he would say to Diego. How do you confront someone about cannibalism? How do you demand answers about murder? How do you look your own family member in the eye and ask them to explain the unthinkable? On Saturday morning, before the restaurant opened, Carlos cornered Diego in the prep kitchen. The conversation started calmly, with Carlos asking innocent questions about suppliers and meat sources. But Diego had survived too much to be fooled by his cousin's nervous energy. "You saw something," Diego said, setting down his knife and looking directly at Carlos. It wasn't a question. Carlos's carefully planned speech evaporated. "What are you doing, Diego? What have you been serving to people?" Diego smiled, and for the first time, Carlos saw his cousin for what he really was. "I'm giving people what they want," Diego said. "The best meat they've ever tasted. Meat that's fresh, local, and free-range." "That's not meat," Carlos whispered. "Those are people. Those are human beings. And they're delicious," Diego replied. "Our customers think so. The food critics think so. Even you thought so, didn't you, Carlos? How many of my special sausages have you eaten over the years?" Carlos felt his knees go weak. He had eaten Diego's cooking hundreds of times. He had recommended dishes to customers. He had fed samples to his own children when they visited the restaurant. "I'm calling the police," Carlos said, reaching for his phone. Diego moved faster than Carlos thought possible. The knife appeared in his cousin's hand like magic, and suddenly Carlos found himself backed against the wall with 8 inches of steel pressed against his throat. "No," Diego said softly. "You're not." What happened next would remain Diego's secret for another 18 months. Carlos Valdez simply vanished. His family filed missing person reports. His friends organized search parties. The police investigated for exactly 2 weeks before moving on to cases with more promising leads. Diego had answers for everything. Carlos had been depressed about business finances. Carlos had mentioned wanting to visit family in Mexico. Carlos had always been unreliable. The restaurant would continue without him. Diego was perfectly capable of handling both the kitchen and management duties. And the restaurant did continue. If anything, it got better. Without Carlos's nervous energy and constant questions, Diego was free to perfect his craft. He streamlined his supply chain, improved his processing techniques, and expanded his menu offerings. The 2013 horse meat scandal in Europe showed how easy it was for fraudulent meat to enter the food supply chain, with some products containing up to 100% undeclared horse meat. But Diego's operation was far more sophisticated than simple species substitution. He was running a full-scale human meat processing operation disguised as a legitimate restaurant. The new menu featured heritage pork that was actually human flesh, grass-fed beef that came from Diego's carefully curated victim selection, and wild game specials that lived up to their name in the most horrific way possible. Food bloggers raved about the restaurant's evolution. Valdez Brothers has reached a new level of culinary excellence, wrote one prominent critic. Their meat has a depth of flavor that can only come from truly artisanal sourcing and preparation. If only they knew how right they were. Detective Maria Santos had worked missing persons cases for 8 years, but the pattern around Valdez Brothers Smokehouse bothered her in ways she couldn't quite articulate. Over the past 2 years, 17 people had disappeared within a 5-mile radius of the restaurant. All were transients, undocumented immigrants, or people whose disappearances wouldn't generate major investigations. Individually, each case made sense. El Paso was a border city with constant population movement. People disappeared for 100 different reasons: immigration enforcement, cartel violence, voluntary relocation, or simple tragedy. But 17 people from the same area? That was a pattern. Santos began mapping the disappearances, looking for connections. Most of the missing persons had been known to frequent the area around Valdez Brothers. Several had been seen asking for work at local businesses, including the restaurant. 3 had been photographed by security cameras within a block of the smokehouse on the days they went missing. But the most disturbing connection was simpler. Every single missing person had been seen eating at Valdez Brothers Smokehouse within 48 hours of their disappearance. Santos requested surveillance footage from nearby businesses, interviewed restaurant staff, and spent countless off-duty hours watching the restaurant's patterns. What she discovered was a man who worked alone, who received deliveries at odd hours, and who had an unusual relationship with the city's most vulnerable population. Diego Valdez wasn't just feeding the homeless, he was recruiting them. Free meals, cash for odd jobs, promises of regular work. He was building relationships with people who wouldn't be missed, gaining their trust, and then making them disappear. Santos knew she needed more evidence before she could get a search warrant. But she also knew that every day she waited, more people were likely dying. She made the decision to conduct an unofficial investigation, one that would either confirm her suspicions or prove her wrong. What she found would exceed her worst nightmares. On October 15, 2023, Detective Santos convinced a judge to issue a search warrant for Valdez Brothers Smokehouse based on circumstantial evidence linking the restaurant to multiple missing persons cases. The warrant was limited. They could search the premises for evidence related to the disappearances, but they couldn't seize the restaurant's food inventory without probable cause of a health code violation. Santos arrived at 6 a.m. with a full forensics team, expecting to find evidence of a crime but hoping she was wrong about the scope of it. The restaurant was closed, but Diego met them at the door with a smile and full cooperation. "Of course, officers," he said. "I want to help find these missing people in any way I can. Our community has lost too many good souls." The search began in the dining room and offices. Financial records, employment documents, security footage, everything seemed perfectly normal for a successful restaurant. Diego answered every question, provided every document, and maintained the demeanor of a helpful business owner concerned about his community. But when the forensics team reached the walk-in freezer, everything changed. The smell hit them first. Not the normal smell of stored meat, but something else, something wrong. The forensics photographer started documenting the freezer's contents when he noticed inconsistencies in the labeling. Packages marked pork shoulder that were the wrong size and shape. Beef brisket that had unusual color and texture. specialty cuts that didn't match any known animal anatomy. Detective Santos made the call to expand the search warrant to include food safety violations. Within an hour, health inspectors arrived to examine the restaurant's meat inventory. What they found would shut down Valdez Brothers Smokehouse permanently and launch the largest criminal investigation in El Paso's history. The forensics report was damning beyond anything Detective Santos had imagined. DNA testing revealed human remains in over 80% of the restaurant's meat inventory. The victims included 14 of the 17 missing persons from Santos's investigation, plus 3 additional people who had never been reported missing. The methodical nature of Diego's operations stunned investigators. He had developed a complete butchering and processing system that could transform a human body into restaurant-quality meat products within 48 hours. His smoking and seasoning techniques effectively masked the taste and texture differences between human and animal flesh. Most horrifying was the revelation that Diego had been serving human meat to customers for over 2 years. Conservative estimates suggested that more than 30,000 people had unknowingly consumed human flesh at Valdez Brothers Smokehouse. The restaurant served an average of 400 customers per day, with many regular customers eating there multiple times per week. The investigation revealed Diego's complete process. Victim selection: Diego targeted vulnerable individuals, homeless people, undocumented immigrants, and others whose disappearances wouldn't generate immediate police attention. He built relationships with them through free meals and offers of employment. Isolation: victims were lured to the restaurant after hours with promises of work or special meals. Diego's prep kitchen was soundproofed and isolated from the main dining area. Processing: Diego's expertise from his father's operation allowed him to efficiently process human remains using standard restaurant equipment. He had modified his prep kitchen with additional drainage and ventilation to handle the work. Integration: human meat was mixed with legitimate animal products to create hybrid offerings. This served both to stretch the illegal meat further and to provide familiar flavors that masked the taste differences. Service: the smoking process and Diego's signature spice blends effectively disguised the source of the meat. Customers consistently praised the unique flavors and tender texture of Valdez Brothers' offerings. Food fraud databases show that meat substitution and dilution are among the most common forms of food fraud, with 188 recorded incidents globally. But Diego's operation went far beyond typical food fraud. It was systematic murder disguised as a culinary business. News of the Valdez Brothers investigation spread through El Paso like wildfire. Within hours of the initial reports, crowds gathered outside the restaurant. Some came out of curiosity, others out of horror, and many came to vomit in the parking lot as they realized what they had been eating. Social media exploded with first-hand accounts from customers. Families who had celebrated birthdays at Valdez Brothers posted anguished messages. Food bloggers deleted their glowing reviews. Local news stations were flooded with calls from viewers demanding to know if they had been exposed to contaminated food. The psychological impact on the community was unprecedented. Dr. Patricia Morales, a trauma counselor who worked with affected families, later described the situation as mass psychological contamination. Thousands of people suddenly realized they had unknowingly participated in cannibalism, creating a form of trauma that few mental health professionals had ever encountered. Support groups formed spontaneously. Churches opened their doors for counseling sessions. The city established a victim services hotline that received over 12,000 calls in the first week after the story broke. Some of the most heartbreaking stories came from regular customers who had brought their children to Valdez Brothers for family meals. Parents struggled to explain to their kids why mommy and daddy were crying, why they couldn't eat meat anymore, why their favorite restaurant was surrounded by police tape. The economic impact was equally devastating. Tourism to El Paso dropped by 40% in the months following the story. Other restaurants in the area saw business decline as people became suspicious of all food establishments. The city's reputation as a culinary destination was permanently damaged. Diego Valdez's trial began on March 15, 2024, amid unprecedented media attention. Court TV provided gavel-to-gavel coverage. International news outlets sent correspondents. The courtroom was packed daily with victims' families, former customers, and curious onlookers. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming. They presented DNA evidence linking Diego to 17 murders. They showed financial records proving his meat costs were impossibly low for a legitimate operation. They brought in customers who testified about the unusual flavors they had experienced at the restaurant. The most damaging testimony came from Dr. Sarah Chin, a forensic anthropologist who had analyzed the remains found at the restaurant. Dr. Chin explained in graphic detail how Diego had processed human bodies, showing the jury bone fragments that had been found in the restaurant's grease traps and identifying cut marks that proved the bodies had been systematically butchered. Diego's defense team attempted to argue that their client was mentally ill, a victim of childhood trauma who had been conditioned to violence by his experiences in Mexico. They brought in expert witnesses to testify about PTSD, dissociative disorders, and the psychological effects of growing up in a war zone. But the prosecution's rebuttal was devastating. They showed that Diego's operation was far too sophisticated and sustained to be the product of mental illness. This wasn't a psychotic break, it was a carefully planned business model that had operated successfully for years. The jury deliberated for just 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on 17 counts of first-degree murder, numerous counts of food tampering, and dozens of health code violations. The judge sentenced Diego Valdez to death, making him eligible for execution by lethal injection. The Valdez brothers' case changed everything about food safety regulation in Texas. The state legislature passed the Carlos Valdez Memorial Food Safety Act, requiring more frequent unannounced inspections of restaurants, enhanced DNA testing of meat products, and mandatory psychological evaluations for anyone applying for a food service license with a criminal background. The restaurant building was demolished within 6 months of Diego's conviction. The lot remained empty for 2 years before being converted into a memorial park honoring the victims. The city of El Paso established a victim compensation fund that provided counseling services and financial support to affected families. For the thousands of people who had eaten at Valdez Brothers, the psychological impact proved longer lasting than anyone anticipated. Many developed severe food aversions, unable to eat meat without experiencing panic attacks. Others became obsessed with knowing the source of every ingredient in their food. Support groups continued meeting years after the restaurant's closure. The case also triggered a nationwide review of restaurant inspection protocols. The FDA implemented new requirements for meat sourcing documentation, and several states began conducting random DNA testing of restaurant meat supplies. Studies of meat fraud cases show that artificial enhancement and replacement of meat products are significant concerns in food safety, with hundreds of documented cases worldwide. Diego Valdez remained on death row for 18 months before his execution on September 22, 2025. He refused all interviews and never expressed remorse for his crimes. His final meal request was denied when he asked for a steak dinner. Prison officials deemed the request inappropriate given the nature of his crimes. Even after Diego's execution, fundamental questions about the Valdez brothers' case remain unanswered. How did he operate for so long without detection? Why didn't health inspectors notice the irregularities in his meat inventory? How many other restaurants might be operating similar schemes? Detective Santos, who led the investigation, believes Diego's case represents a perfect storm of factors that allowed the crimes to continue: a vulnerable victim population, inadequate food safety oversight, and a perpetrator with exactly the right skill set to exploit systemic weaknesses. Diego wasn't just a killer, Santos reflected in a recent interview. He was an entrepreneur who saw an opportunity to reduce costs and increase profits by using free raw materials. The fact that those raw materials were human beings was secondary to the business model. The case has become a study subject in criminal justice programs nationwide. Forensic psychology students analyze Diego's methods and motivations. Food safety experts use the case to illustrate the importance of supply chain transparency. Ethics professors debate whether the unknowing customers bear any moral responsibility for the crimes. Perhaps most disturbing is the realization of how easy it was for Diego to succeed. His victims were chosen specifically because they wouldn't be missed. His customers never questioned the source of their food because it tasted good and was reasonably priced. The systems designed to protect public safety failed at every level. The Valdez Brothers Smokehouse case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about trust, community, and the food we eat. For decades, Americans have become increasingly disconnected from their food sources. We trust restaurants, suppliers, and regulatory agencies to ensure our safety without understanding how that system actually works. Diego Valdez exploited that trust with surgical precision. He understood that people would believe what they wanted to believe, that his meat was exceptional because of superior sourcing and preparation, not because of its horrific true nature. He knew that a friendly smile and consistent quality would override any suspicions customers might have. The case also highlights the vulnerability of marginalized populations. Diego's victims were chosen not randomly, but strategically. They were people who wouldn't be missed, whose disappearances wouldn't generate major investigations, whose lives society had already decided were less valuable. In the end, the Valdez brothers case serves as a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it wears an apron, serves you dinner with a smile, and thanks you for your business. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who make us feel safe, fed, and cared for. The next time you sit down at your favorite restaurant, ask yourself, do you really know what you're eating? Do you know where it came from? Do you know who prepared it? Because in a world where trust can be weaponized and hospitality can hide horror, those questions might be more important than you think. What would you do if you discovered you had unknowingly consumed human flesh? How would you cope with that knowledge? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story left you questioning everything you thought you knew about food safety, make sure to like this post and subscribe to Unmasking Evil for more shocking investigations into the darkest corners of human nature. Share this story with friends and family, because in a world full of hidden dangers, knowledge is the only protection we have. Hit that notification bell and comment below with your thoughts on the Valdez brothers case. What other food safety nightmares are hiding in plain sight? Remember, the most dangerous monsters are often the ones serving us dinner.